Johnson. Middle East peace talks may once again be in danger. Secretary of State John Kerry canceled his scheduled visit to the region today.
That after Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas renewed his plan to pursue statehood status at the United Nations. John Waggy has more in tonight's top story.
These Palestinians are celebrating the decision by President Mahmoud Abbas to restart his UN campaign for a state of Palestine by applying to more than a dozen international conventions and agencies, something he had promised to suspend as a condition of talks with Israel. The men chant, "To Jerusalem we are going," as martyrs in the millions. The Palestinian party scenes represent a setback for the Obama administration, which has been pushing hard for Israel to release more than 100 Palestinian prisoners with blood on their hands in exchange for an extension of talks. Also in the mix, U.S. prisoner Jonathan Pollard, convicted nearly 30 years ago of spying on the U.S. for Israel. The White House has steadfastly refused to release Pollard, but last week the administration floated the idea of freeing him to keep the Middle East peace talks going.
I think it is a cynical move by Secretary Kerry and by our Prime Minister to put Pollard on the table.
Many in Israel wonder how the U.S. could imprison Pollard for decades after he gave information to an ally, while at the same time demanding that Israel release hundreds of Palestinian murderers as part of a peace deal.
It is a bittersweet feeling. We want to see Jonathan Pollard coming back home after 29 years in jail. But at the same time, we cannot accept this agreement. We cannot release hundreds of murderers who were convicted in murdering Jewish people.
Pollard is in terrible health, and his ex-wife Anne wants to see him freed, despite the high cost to Israel.
I pray that the Israeli government right now, that Bibi Netanyahu and his security cabinet will do all in its power to make sure that Jonathan is released now, because I am so afraid for his health right now, and I really, truly, I have no idea how he's lasted this long, and I have no idea how much longer he could last.
The Palestinians claim they haven't given up on the peace talks, but the ratcheting up of their diplomatic battle against Israel in the UN is not welcome in Jerusalem or Washington, and Secretary Kerry was reduced Tuesday to the most basic diplomatic plea.
We urge both sides to show restraint while we work with them.
The question for Netanyahu is whether he will submit to what some Israelis call U.S. blackmail. Freedom for Pollard in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners and still more talks with Abbas. It's a deal that could shake up the Prime Minister's government. John Waggy, CBN News.
And joining us now with more on this is Cliff May, the president of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Cliff, what are your thoughts on the Obama administration pushing for the release of more than 100 Palestinian prisoners to jumpstart the peace talks?
Well, I don't think that is a good idea. These are terrorists. They have blood on their hands. If they're released, there's a very good chance that a fair percentage of them will go back to terrorism. I think it sends a bad message generally that terrorists can be released, not in exchange for any significant concessions, but just to get Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, to sit at the table, to talk with the Israelis, to pretend that he's willing to make a deal. I think it's objectionable.
Well, should the release of Jonathan Pollard be part of this peace talks deal?
I don't think it should be in any way, shape, or form. I think it should have nothing whatsoever to do with it. This is about whether or not there's going to be recognition of Israel as it is a homeland for the Jewish people, a minority in the Middle East that has self-determination as other minorities and other nationalities should have, whether the various peoples of the Middle East, in particular the Palestinians and other Arabs, can live with a non-Muslim, non-Arab neighbor and can tolerate that. This should have nothing whatsoever to do with Jonathan Pollard. That's a very separate issue.
Cliff, for more than 20 years, as you know, both Republican and Democrat administrations have pursued a two-state solution in the region and the establishment of a Palestinian state, but that seems to continue to go nowhere. Why is that?
Well, I'm afraid that the root cause of that, Mark, is that the Palestinian leadership and many within the West Bank and Gaza are less interested in having a state of their own than they are in destroying the one Jewish state in the Middle East, the one Jewish state in the world. The Palestinians have been offered statehood on many occasions. There's no question in my mind that Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, would like to pursue a two-state solution. But a two-state solution means the Israelis recognize the Palestinians as neighbors and try to get along with them, and that's important, and that the Palestinians recognize the Israelis, a Jewish state with a substantial minority of Arabs, Muslims, Christians, Baha'i, Druze, others. And that's not yet in the cards on the Palestinian side. They're not willing to do it. Keep in mind that there are not yet Palestinian state institutions of the kind that would be necessary for sovereignty and independence. Keep in mind that the Palestinian Authority depends on Israel for security, for energy, to keep the lights going, for water, for many things. If the Israelis were to turn all that off, they wouldn't do very well. And the Palestinians also depend on American taxpayers and others in Europe to keep their economy afloat, because they have not been willing to do what's necessary to establish an economic structure that is viable. Absolutely possible to do. There's been great economic growth in the West Bank, but that only happens in cooperation with Israel. And keep in mind, too, that Gaza is ruled by Hamas, and that's a terrorist organization with Iranian ties, and it totally not only rejects the existence of Israel, but has sworn genocide.
Okay, well, Cliff May with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thanks, Cliff, for being with us.
Thank you, Mark.